The principle of sufficient reason, modern science, expansion of the universe. Cosmological arguments for God's existence. Are they valid or are they not? Let's find out. Okay, so in our trek down the cosmological argument for God's existence, we have gone through several different arguments, from the column cosmological argument to the unmoved mover. The uncaused causer kind of fits within the basic unmoved mover structure and style. You have the necessary being, and then you have three more. You might argue that two of them should be under one category, but we'll deal with these three as kind of the final culmination of the cosmological argument, or the varieties of it. So let's get into it. We're going to start with Gottfried Leibniz. Totally said that wrong. And the principle of sufficient reason, which I don't know that you could say that he really initiated this argument. He may have systematized it, but this argument has existed for a very, very, very long time. But what does this argument say? Before I show you, or before we walk through it, I just want you to know this argument is super easy. For once, we have an easy argument. In fact, the whole thing relies upon the principle of sufficient reason, which is fun, because if you say, I don't believe in the principle of sufficient reason, I would ask you, well, why is that? And then you would try and give me a sufficient reason to explain why the principle of sufficient reason doesn't work. And I think we all see why that would be problematic. So, let's go through it. Number one, nothing happens without a sufficient reason. This kind of sounds like the unmoved mover, the way that I explained it a little bit. So, what does that mean? Well, that means that if something happens, there's a sufficient reason to explain why that happens. Okay, but why do you keep saying sufficient reason? That's a good question. Well, anybody can come up with a reason for something, and that reason could be complete, incomplete, or somewhere in between. I guess there's a somewhere in between, but either way, when we say a reason, it could be valid or invalid. We don't know what kind of reason that would be. When we say sufficient reason, that means able to take in the complete reason as to why something is or is not what it is or is not. So when we say sufficient reason, we mean the complete valid explanation, missing nothing from the explanation, if you will. So if we say nothing that happens without a sufficient reason, that means everything that happens has a sufficient reason for explaining, well, why it happened, how it happened, all the pieces that go together with the whatever happened. That's called the principle of sufficient reason. Everything requires a sufficient reason. Again, you can't deny it without using a sufficient reason, thereby your denial. You're like proving yourself wrong in all kinds of ways. So, to deny this principle of sufficient reason is to refute yourself. So it has to be valid. Got it? Everything needs a reason. Everything the way it is, it needs a reason. If it happens, it has a sufficient reason to explain why it has happened or is the way that it is. Okay, so what's point number two? The universe exists, and thus it must have a sufficient reason for existing. Okay, you're right. The universe does exist and must have a sufficient reason for existing, or being what it is, or just being in general. I guess technically that is true. Okay, so what's the conclusion here? Well, thus, the reason for the universe existing must be found outside of the universe. Why does it have to be found outside of the universe? Well, because if the universe itself requires a sufficient reason, then the universe can't be its own sufficient reason. Otherwise, the universe would have to be greater than itself to be its own sufficient reason, which would be stupid. That doesn't work. So, the universe needs a sufficient reason, and it can't be its own sufficient reason. It needs something that is, well, great enough to be the sufficient reason for being the way it is, for existing, for all of that. And therefore you're left with something greater than the universe. So what's greater than all of space and time in reality itself? Omnipotence. That's pretty much better and greater rather than all things. The universe, space, time, all of it. something omnipotent is required to be a sufficient reason for all things. That's pretty much it. Everything requires a sufficient reason. Whatever that thing is can't be its own sufficient reason. The universe is something, requires a sufficient reason, therefore you need a God to be the sufficient reason for all things. It's kind of a logical necessity based on the principle of sufficient reason. Okay, now there are some obvious counter-arguments that have been brought to the attention of people presenting this argument. One of those would be this. Okay, everything needs a sufficient reason. God is something. Therefore God needs a sufficient reason. All you're doing is applying the principle of sufficient reason to God himself, and you're thereby demonstrating that God can't be his own sufficient reason, because then oh man, that's a problem. I guess we've just disproved this whole thing. Well, have we? Have we really? I mean, have we really taken God and omnipotence seriously enough in order to present why this doesn't actually work? The rebuttal doesn't work? I would argue no, we haven't. Here's how a response should look to that counter-argument. An omnipotent being, by definition, would be the sufficient reason for all things. By its own existence and definition, it is the sufficient reason for all things. It cannot have a sufficient reason because it is the sufficient reason. In other words, all laws of logic, all everything, principle sufficient reason, all of it terminate in omnipotence. Until you reach something with omnipotence, then you can apply the principle sufficient reason to it. And only when you reach omnipotence do you end that whole supply chain or necessity chain. Thus, you can't ask, well, what's God's sufficient reason? Because that wouldn't make sense. Because being omnipotent means you are the sufficient reason for all things. You are the source of the principle itself. The principle has no meaning outside of omnipotence itself. Well, that's pretty easy. That makes sense. Good. All right. What else? Good question. Well, let's talk about modern science. So there have been a lot of theists that have relied upon the question of modern science, specifically dealing with the universe itself and Big Bang cosmology, in order to demonstrate that the universe had a beginning and therefore a beginner. Now, before we get into this, notice that the arguments that impress me are the ones that don't deal with specific scientific findings as their root core. The reason for that is, I do not believe that you can take specific scientific findings and prove God's existence from them. Science is always changing, always updating, always getting better and more advanced, and it's explaining how the universe exists in the form that it exists, the application of that form, the modification of that form. I think that science can tell us everything about the universe, but it can't actually tell us anything about a creator of that universe. Science is limited. Ultimately, you need philosophy, theology to really ask questions of, but the universe itself. In other words, science relies upon the existence of the universe in order for science to work. But I'm asking questions about the existence of the universe. Once it's already existing, science can take it from there in large ways. So you're going to find that I'm not really a big fan of this current cosmological argument dealing with modern science. And sometimes this gets thrown into the question of the God of the gaps. In other words, we don't know what's happening here, therefore it's God. Something that Christians and Muslims and theists in general have been doing for a very long time, and they should not be doing this. It's not helpful, it's not good thinking, and I would stand with the atheists in arguing against God of the gaps thinking. But let's go ahead and walk through this, and you can judge if I'm right or wrong. Maybe you disagree with me. Maybe I'm completely off on this. But I'm going to present the argument to you, and let's see where it goes. So it starts off, the universe came into existence 13.7 billion years ago. Okay, so modern science is telling us right now the universe seemingly exploded from a singularity 13.7 billion years ago, and so sometimes theists will take this as the universe came from nothing. I challenge you to find a scientist today that says that it was an actual nothing that it came from. They always use the word singularity, and that matters, unfortunately, for the theistic position. This is the game you're always going to be in. Science itself cannot look for an, abstract being to explain concrete scientific things. So you're running into an issue already. But nonetheless, the argument would say the universe popped into existence 13.7 billion years ago. That's the Big Bang. Boom, there it is. Number 2, the universe is comprised of all existing matter, space, and time. Not contentious. Number 3, thus, before the universe existed, nothing existed. Very contentious. Because again, they'll say a singularity, not nothing. But if they did say nothing, then this argument would maybe work. So point number 4, if ever there was nothing, there can never be something or anything. True. So if ever there was nothing, you can't have a universe pop into existence once there's nothing unless you have a God who causes that to take place, or some sort of an omnipotent being that causes all of reality itself to come into existence. I think you may be starting to see why I'm not a huge fan of this type of argumentation, because it is at the whims of what science is finding at that exact moment. Now, I do not question what science is finding. 13.7 billion years, that's what it looks like when you look out at the stars and measure the speed of light and the background radiation and the color shift and everything else. That's about right. That doesn't mean nothing existed during that singularity, when everything was compressed together. Just because we can't measure time or really see back that far, we can get to within about 500 million years. But that still leaves 500 million years and longer that we don't know what that means. We don't know what that looks like. And so in some way you're arguing a little bit from we don't know, therefore God. And that's always a dangerous place to be. Not a big fan of looking at modern scientific findings, especially with astronomy, and saying therefore God. Now, you can interpret things as the universe operates this way, life operates this way, or whatever, and therefore God created it that way. Let's figure out maybe what he was trying to accomplish. You can do things like that. That's fine. In fact, I encourage stuff like that. But trying to prove God's existence based upon scientific findings is going to be a fruitless endeavor, I would argue, because scientific findings aren't asking those questions. They're asking different questions. How does the universe operate? The universe God created, how do they operate? Or if you're an atheistic scientist, how does this universe that's always existed, how does it operate? That's not a question of, so, God. Just not there. And it shouldn't be there, to be perfectly honest. So, not a big fan of this particular argument type. It is out there. I want you to be, aware of it. But I will join the atheists largely and others in disputing its validity. Okay. There is another argument dealing with the universe, though, and this one's kind of fun, I got to be honest. It's pretty fun. It does rely upon the notion that the universe is expanding, which isn't really a contentious notion, and it's kind of bridging the gap between the scientific and the philosophical, which I find to be really entertaining. So let's walk through this. So this argument, it's a cosmological argument based upon modern science to a degree. Let's see what it looks like. Number 1, the universe is expanding. Not really a contentious point at all. In fact, the question is, how fast is it expanding? And is it going to expand so fast that the separation speed will be faster than the speed of light, in which case, as you look out into the night sky, eventually stars will disappear because we're moving a separation faster than light. Oh my gosh, thermal heat death, we're all going to die. The universe is expanding, not a contentious point. It's just an obvious point. Okay. So if the universe is expanding, doesn't that mean it's limited in size? Like its nature, its size, all like the stuff of the universe, it's limited in essence? If the universe and all of reality is expanding, you have already assumed that it's limited in some way. Otherwise, it couldn't be expanding. It would simply be everything. So if the universe is expanding, you've already assumed that the universe is limited by nature. Otherwise, it can't expand. It would be unlimited. And if it's unlimited, then it's already everything. But if you're saying a universe is limited, you have also said something else automatically, and that is, it's limited because something else is limiting it. In other words, you can't have something limited unless you've already assumed that there is something able to limit and causing the limitation. Even an expanding thing, it still has limitations by something that has the ability to limit it. Like a balloon, for instance. A balloon, when you expand it, what's causing the limitation? Why isn't it an infinite balloon? Well, air pressure, size, gravity, all those things play into it. When you speak of something expanding or growing, you've already assumed that it's not infinite, it's limited, and if you say something's limited, you've already assumed that there's something that is causing the limitation. So the question is, when you're talking about the universe, or if you want to go multiverse, all of it, the entire reality itself, what's causing the limitation? Well, there would have to be something that's unlimited that causes it to be limited, otherwise it would be unlimited. But it's not unlimited. So, if you postulate a limited reality or universe, you've already assumed something else exists that's unlimited that causes the limitation. And that thing we will call an omnipotent God. It's a fun little argument. I really like this argument. It's so clever and so interesting, and it uses language and concepts in a very philosophical and creative way that's sharp to the point and profound at the same time. Does it completely work? Maybe. It works on a limited expanding universe. That would be true. It has to be valid. But if you have someone that does expand to a multiverse, which I only briefly said something about, I kind of glossed over that. If you do have a multiverse, and that multiverse is actually infinite and takes up infinite space and infinite time and everything else, well then obviously this argument would fall apart because everything is infinite. Everything is all of it. But maybe that would actually be the case, maybe not. I mean, how could you have finite things within an infinite thing? That would be part of an infinite thing. So finite things making up infinite things, it would have to always be infinite, in which case all things within an infinite thing would have to also be infinite, of which our universe is not, because it's expanding. So you can make the argument that this is abstracted enough to where it can work, no matter if it's just our universe or a multiverse, infinite multiverses. Again, because you have the dichotomy with the infinite and finite in reality. Never mind the fact that you still have the problem with a realized infinity. We'll let that go by the wayside with Al-Ghazali. So anyway, all right. So hopefully that helped. Hopefully these three arguments will spark some thinking in your mind. Hopefully you'll see kind of what I'm saying about why I don't like arguments that start with mathematical findings and tries to prove something that's not really in the realm of science. So you're going to be moving into the God of gaps. But also hopefully you saw why the other arguments that I've presented, specifically the two in this category where we're talking about the principle of sufficient reason and also to a certain degree the nature of infinity, how both of those are going to be much more powerful arguments because they actually don't care what science says. They don't care what new scientific science can figure anything out. It doesn't matter. These arguments are still valid. That's why I like them so much, because now you're getting to the nature of reality itself. You're getting to the foundational stuff. And I find them to be convincing, with the exception of the second one, which we already talked about. So, leave some comments if you are confused. Ask me questions or ask for clarification. If you think I'm wrong on something, let me know. If you think that I'm right, let me know. And yeah, talk to you later. Have a good one.